Hey, this part I'm going to talk about the importance of data, which obviously has been coming up in the course already, but particularly around the kind of social science work about how um, the importance of data itself is really changing what it means to be a person. Um, so we all kind of basically give up our data every day just by being on stuff, on your phone, on a platform, whatever. We kind of consent to this in many ways. Um, Basically, you don't read the terms and conditions because they're all like 85 pages of legalese, but basically what it means is essentially you just press yes and off you go and you've consented to kind of give up your data. Increasingly, there's a lot of pernicious things that are going on there that we'll look at throughout the course. I mean, many people didn't know there, for instance, that like if you just agreed to use Facebook Messenger, you were agreeing to let it turn on your microphone every now and then. So it doesn't mean it was listening to you all the time, but sometimes it actually was. So it's common for us to give up this kind of consent, but not think too much about it. And we kind of see it as a trade-off, to use all these kind of free products, access to consumer spaces, mobility, convenience, social media to be able to talk to each other. Um, there has been a kind of key process of enshittification. Cory Doctorow's wonderful phrase to think about what happens to those platforms. Many times what happens is you give up your consent to your data. Of course, they're free, and then after a while they introduce subscriptions anyway. And Spotify and others, are Netflix and um, a good example of that, Twitter, trying to get more and more money out of them. Um, so when you use these platforms, things like Spotify, YouTube, your social media feeds, the argument is that they're gathering your data to make the experience better for you. That it's learning about your preferences, and therefore it's giving you your preferences, and you'll be able to kind of giving your preferences back to you, and you therefore be able to kind of have a better experience. Now, in some ways, I'd say that's true, but for the most part, these days, that's not true at all. And like anyone that's been on Facebook or many other sites, those like that in recent years, which would know that you're basically being fed commercial stuff more and more. So the platform takes your data, it suggests contact content with you, and the basic level it's meant to kind of match your tastes and hook you up and connect you with other people. The idea here is too that like they are, trying to shape what you consume, not necessarily determining what you buy, but you can still choose not to buy stuff. We're not determined by this. Um, but even people that kind of argue that advertising doesn't work on them, if you're kind of interviewing them about this kind of stuff, will say eventually that maybe at some stage they have been affected by an ad and bought something. So, um, you know, the notions of choice here are interesting. This kind of predictable kind of marketing replaces the kind of targeting and surveyed focus groups and profiling of the past. This is all happening automatically. Um, there's like these huge kind of bot automated auctions that are going on for the next ad in your feed, like every second, every millisecond. And this is particularly hard for us to kind of get a grip on, I think, in terms of understanding how it works. So yeah, while you kind of may think your phone's listening to you sometimes, and it kind of freaks you out when I don't know, might be talking to someone about tennis, and then you get a tennis racket ad or something. What's also may be happening there is that kind of auction may actually be getting something right, like 100% right, based on what's going on. It might necessarily be listening to you. It might have just got the auction right. Um, but also what we know is like much of that kind of data gathering and trying to sell you stuff and kind of nudge you to do particular things often doesn't work. And you will all experience getting kind of weird and wonderful things on your feed based on, and you kind of scratch your head sometimes why you're getting that. So data, it's basically we're producing it in everything we do, not just online, but like being out in public space now, you're kind of under the vision of various cameras and all kinds of ways of your day-to-day life is producing this. Even having your phone in your pocket, it's kind of tracking your location so we're constantly kind of producing data in more and more facets of our life. Um, Increasingly, the data in and of itself is the market. So while data is used on these platforms to sell you stuff or, to encourage you to stay online longer or whatever, the data itself now is a key commodity, and data markets are billion, if not trillion dollar industries. And this is important to understand from a sociological perspective because this is where the mission and function creep happens. data collected on one site for particular things is bought and on-sold and traded and for different things. And here, epistemologically, thinking about where kind of good data may be a good fit for the purposes, brings in the risks that that's simply not the case, and it kind of therefore contributes to that garbage in, garbage out model that's so problematic in terms of how algorithms work in those kind of other fields, such as policing and um, border protection and all kinds of things like that. So that kind of personal taste stuff is increasingly enrolled in these other things. And from, a kind of basic sociological perspective, we would very much question the methodological and legitimacy of doing those kind of things. But this is what the industry does regardless, and there's not a lot of care taken to it as long as the machine is doing the things that they want to do in one way or another. The accuracy isn't all that important. So there's no doubt your own data will be influencing what you consume, how you're targeted, but the data itself is now an increasingly important commodity for other means. So that's an important thing to consider in terms of how capitalism now works. There's been a lot of, I think, really interesting and excellent work to think about what this means for being a human being. Haggerty and Erickson introduced the idea of the data double, quarter of a century ago now, in terms of thinking about how this means in terms of surveillance and policing. And that's been a particularly important way of thinking about how data affects what we are as a person, and how we have kind of our own data self that's like a mirror or distorted copy of us online, and how this kind of is important in terms of how we're associated with things. A really interesting paper is Laguson's paper about just the kind of emphasis on big data and volumes of data actually hasn't actually made things all that more accurate, increase and produces what they call artificially intelligent data doubles. This is systematically distorted things that serve institutional profit and control rather than accurate representation of things. And again, that's an important way of thinking about what's going on here. The Australian sociologist Deborah Lupton has discussed the data self, particularly in relation to self-tracking and other forms of data production, particularly in the way we think about health and the way we kind of want to be healthy, good citizens and good workers, and the different ways we kind of use data to do that, and how that relates to things like wellness and health and the distortion of those things. In my own work that's not published yet, I'm hoping it'll come out soon, I've been talking about the idea of the data zombie. In this kind of, it's a metaphor for thinking about how we kind of know this kind of data haunts us. It kind of seems it's just over our shoulder, kind of tethered to us. Um, it's not quite yourself. It's kind of this mirror image of you in a way. It's kind of distorted image of you. It's a result of the dead free labor you're doing online all the time. And it kind of, like zombies, can have some kind of detrimental effects on, on the way that you live. So I'll talk about that throughout the course as well. One of the readings set this week, I think, is a really excellent book. It's kind of relatively old now in this field, but I think it's an excellent introduction. So if you're interested in understanding more about what data means, the data self means today, I think this is a particularly good place to start. It points out we're kind of living in a world of ubiquitous network communication, ubiquitous surveillance, and pretty much everything we do today has the capacity to be observed, recorded, analysed, stored, bought and sold. Huge governmental, commercial, infrastructural implications for this. But again, as individual people, we don't seem to have a lot of say over how our data is used and what's done with it, and then for the effects that it has on us and the effects it has on other people. This is increasingly problematic because, as we've spoken about already, these kind of data feeds into algorithms, and these algorithms are determining more and more of the contours of our world without us really knowing how, what Frank Pasquale has called the black box society. So these things can kind of define us. They put us into categories, whether that might be a high cost person, an unreliable worker, as later in the course, Bev Skeggs points out, this kind of low-hanging fruit versus as a kind of subject of value. But we don't really know we're being categorized by this, and therefore we don't really get a chance to kind of maybe be better at the things that they want us to do, or kind of change that kind of thing, which we kind of can in many of the other kind of more traditional ways that we're categorized. So this, has profound effects then on like, how we live our lives and, the things we get access to or whether we get a job or not or whether we get medical insurance or these all these other things. What this book is really important, I think, and good at showing is like the way that our data self isn't really you. It's not, it's a version of you. It's a distorted version of you, but often it's not like you're not online, the data version of you, say, it's like Steve Threadgold. It's not just me. Really, what happens there is it's more the way that we're putting categories. That individual is kind of put into these categories of high cost or unreliable worker, or, as the book points out, terrorist or citizen, and all these other important categories. Um, and that you don't have any real control over that. And really, it's often not very accurate. The chapter that talks about citizenship, for instance, kind of in the US shows that the NSA uses data that kind of, if it points out you're 51% not a citizen in terms of its data, regardless if you are a citizen or not in legal terms, this is how the algorithm treats you. And again, it's relying upon all this kind of other data that isn't necessarily about citizenship. It's about who you associate with, where you're at, what you read, and all these other things. So this is kind of fascinating changes in terms of how power works, in terms of how institutions treat us, and about how we can live our day-to-day lives and what this means for inequality. Another really good book to think about this is Tanya Kant's what I think is a great piece of empirical research called Making It Personal, where she does this kind of small scale kind of experimental research, mostly with young people, about how they use different platforms, how they understand the way that they're under the data gaze, and how they know they're kind of giving up consent in many ways, but like the trade-offs about that and what they think about that. And what she shows is like, the users routinely kind of understand that they're being tracked, that their habits and movements are being kind of exchanged and all this kind of stuff. In most ways, we're kind of happy to do that. It's not really about like goodwill. It just seems to be more about like a kind of Faustian bargain, really, a pact that we kind of can't really avoid these things. We know that the drive to personalization kind of is underpinning a lot of what's going on. Um, and what's interesting is she shows in many of the ways that people kind of in their day-to-day lives trying to resist or make do in these systems. They're not always just giving up and like just getting on with using stuff. They may like find ways to be able to kind of some platforms hide their data and others that don't care as much. So across the board, people are kind of dealing with a bunch of different platforms and they often behave differently on these differently towards things like privatization, depending on what platform they're on. As Cheney-Lippold points out, though, in the We Are Data book, the kind of idea of personalization, that idea that they're kind of personalizing our feeds or platforms or whatever for our own good, really isn't what they're doing. They're more profiling us for their own good and for their own economic circumstances and their own profit-driven desires. A particular really interesting example is from The Afterlife of Data by Mary Evelyn, where she points out this quite incredible example of her own life where she had a miscarriage in 2011. But it's like the platforms that were on after that treated her that she had the baby anyway. And she was constantly still being sent all this stuff about being a mother. And she reflects on the kind of distressing aspects of that. So I think that what she calls the baby here a data revenant. She was obviously behaving online while pregnant and, maybe while conceiving, looking at things, and then while pregnant, looking at things. And then this kind of becomes part of her data self, part of her past, the way that like algorithms there predict what she wants in the future. It doesn't really pick up maybe that she like doesn't have the baby. And now then in the future treats her as someone that's now a mother. And this has kind of really kind of right, quite interesting and sometimes quite disturbing ramifications for her own life. She can't seem to ever forget that, that she didn't have this baby and the kind of trauma that instills. This is one particularly interesting example, but that stuff like that's happening, millions of times a day, across the world. So the afterlife of data there is really interesting. And again, it's a really good example of how the data collected, the data that then associates us with various categories, really is a very much a distortion and not an accurate picture of your own life. Okay, I'll leave it there and come back and talk to Roger about categorizing and classifying.